Code it now. Write a program to initialize an array to random numbers and find the biggest and smallest. So we have a hint here that says use the math.max and math.min methods for this. And of course, we're also going to have to use the math.random method to generate the random numbers. And for the math.max and math.min, the way these work is they receive two arguments. So we'll call the first one in the list argument A and the second one argument B. And what math.max does is it returns the greater of the two arguments. So if A is greater than B, then it returns A. If B is greater than A, it returns B. And math.min does the same thing, but the opposite. So if A is greater than B, then it returns B. And if B is greater than A, then it returns A. So pretty simple. So now let's go over to our JGrass window. Start a new file with Control-N. Enter for Java. Let's copy the contents of an old file. It doesn't really matter which file. Control-C. Go back to the Untitled window. Control-V to paste. Let's change the name of the file in this top level comment. So let's call this one RandomMinMax. And we'll also change the name in the class declaration. So RandomMinMax. And then let's get rid of the old contents in the main method that we will no longer need. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is initialize an array of random numbers. So the first thing we want to do is decide how big we want our array to be. So let's just make a small array. We don't really want that many numbers, but it doesn't really matter what value you choose. So we'll say int array. We'll call it rand equals new int array, and we'll do of size, let's say 10, semicolon. So now what we want to do is go through this array, so iterate over it and fill it in with the random values. So for int I equals 0, as long as I is less than rand.length I plus plus. Then we need our curly braces. Okay, and now we can actually start filling in values. So what we want to do is rand I, because we want to access it at index I, equals, so now we need to generate the value. So we're going to want to cast it to an int, because remember, math.random always returns a double. And in terms of actual values that we want, let's say math.random, because remember, math.random returns a number from 0 to 9, my mistake, from 0.0 to 0.9999999 repeating. So let's do math.random times 10 to get, more reasonable values, like from 0 to 9 instead of from 0.0 to 0.9999. And we put that in parentheses because we wanted to cast this whole statement to an integer, and that'll just drop the decimal place. And of course, don't forget your semicolon. Okay, so now that we have done that, let's just add a small comment in here. So fill rand with random values from 0 to 9. Okay, and now the next thing we're going to want to do is we want to write the code that will find the biggest value and the smallest value. So one of the ways of going about this, and it's a very logical way, is you start off by saying, okay, let's take the first element from the array, and let's just assume for the moment that that is the biggest and the smallest, element in the array. And then we can go through the rest of the array and say, okay, if we find a value that's bigger, then that becomes the new biggest value. And likewise, if we find a value that's smaller, then that becomes the new smallest value. And then this way, at the very end, once we've iterated over all the elements of the array, we have the biggest value and we have the smallest value. So that's what we're going to do. So we have int big equals, and we'll just, like I said, we'll just assign it to the first value. So ran0 and int small equals ran0. Okay, and now we can go ahead and iterate over our loop. So for int I equals, now remember we're already assuming that the biggest and smallest value we're setting them equal to right now to the first array element at index 0. So instead of starting with 0, because obviously if we compare the first array element to the first array element, then we're not going to be changing the values. So instead of starting from 0, we'll start from 1. So int I equals 1, and as long as I is less than rand.length, we do I++. Okay, now we can start filling in our for loop. So what we would do is say big equals math.max big. So we want to compare big to the values in the rand array. So rand I. Okay, and then we want to do the same thing for small. So small equals math, but instead of max, we want to use min. So small, and then rand I. And of course, you need your semicolons. All right, and then after all of this, what we might want to do is just print out the values of the biggest and smallest, numbers that we found. So let's do that. So let's see, system.out.println. So we can say the biggest value was, and then big, and then we'll put another space. And the smallest value was, and then we put small. And of course, close the parentheses and semicolon. Okay, so now what we should do is we should definitely add a comment to explain what's going on here in this lower half of the code. So find and print the smallest and largest random values from rand. From, let's say, from the rand array. Okay, so now let's save with Control S, enter, and then compile with Control B. Okay, so we compiled successfully, and then run with Control R. All right, so let's see what our result was. So the biggest value was 8 and the smallest value was 0. So that definitely sounds like our code worked correctly because we have a fairly large value, in terms of the range, because our range, remember, is from 0 to 9, and this is 8, so that's pretty big. And the smallest value was 0, so that's definitely the smallest possible value, so that's a good sign. We could of course run it again just to confirm. So Control R, and oh, look at this. This time for the biggest value, we got 9. So we definitely know our code is working correctly. And again, we got the smallest value was 0. And you could just keep running it as many times as you want, just to, confirm that it's working the way you would expect, and just to see what kind of values it puts out.